Hello and welcome everybody to our webinar with Teresa Campbell of THC Consult, talking about the yin and yang of leadership. Now I'm going to pop up a slide deck, and I'm going to work our way through the slide deck in just a moment. And you will be able to see. So I want you to tell me now that you see my slide deck, okay?
Absolutely. Perfect.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, perfect. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this slide deck. I'm just going to position the webinar. We walk through the slide deck, and I'll hand over to Teresa, I think 2 slides into this. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll have a Q&A where Teresa and myself, if needs be, will try to answer your questions. So the first one, the name of today's webinar is Balancing the Yin and Yang of Leadership for Heightened Success. And a nice quote here from Jung that Teresa popped up: personal development of a human being depends on the level of integration of their inner masculine and feminine pole. There's a new one on me, Teresa, so I'm looking forward to you explaining it to me as we run through.
As we go through.
And what I've popped up here is nice photo of Teresa and her profile. Teresa is the founder and director of THC Consultancy. It's an Irish-based company, but she's a global reach. She's actually an occupational psychologist by training, an educator, a business executive coach. I think you're a certified mediator as well, Teresa, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And your motto is knowing me, understanding you, which I really sort of like. In fact, I think I've got a book over here called Know Me, Know You as well. So, but you specialize a lot in the whole area of behavior, relations, motivation, and engagement at work. That's really your area, and facilitation and training in the area in those areas. So I'm really excited to hear what you're going to say. I remember you doing the certification training with me years ago. So you've been at this for a long time, Teresa. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to your thoughts. Okay, the session objectives. What we want to accomplish today is we want to take the best of talent practices, like what's the best out there, and what are the key trends guiding future leadership. We want to establish what modern day workforce values the most, so what's important to them, and what implications does that actually have for leadership practice now and going into the future. I'm really excited to hear this bit, discuss exactly what is balanced yin and yang leadership that companies need most. And this idea of the two core dualities, I'm sort of interested in that, the 2 core dualities, and what that actually means. Forceful, enabling, strategic, operational. So that's sort of interesting. And examine leadership through the lens of DISC. We're also going to look at driving forces, but primarily DISC, and EQ a bit as well. I think we'll be looking at Teresa, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
And the real takeaway that Teresa is trying to accomplish today is steps to achieving balanced leadership. So what are the practical steps you can take to achieve balanced leadership in an inclusive workspace? So without any further ado, Teresa, I'm going to click into the first slide and say, off you go.
Hey, thank you very much, Porrick. Lovely working with you this morning, and welcome to all our guests. I suppose to give some background to this, I've come across the Global Leadership Forecast 2021, and it's presented by a group called Development Dimensions International, or DDI. And I think they have invaluable information there that is relevant right across globally, and particularly relevant to Ireland. So it's the culmination, it's a report examining responses from over 2,000 human resource professionals and over 16,000 leaders from across the globe, 50 countries and 24 major industry sectors.
I actually read it, Teresa. I hadn't heard about it until I saw your slide deck. Yes. And I actually went out and I got it, and well, I Googled it up the pop and I read it. Really, really interesting.
Really interesting and really, really relevant. Yeah. And so note the gender balance of the respondents, 69% male, 31 female, whether that actually impacts the outcomes, let's see. But it's very, very interesting. It also looks across the three generations, the baby boomers, Generation X, and the millennials. And for the first time ever, they tell us that we've got 5 generations working in the workplace now. And I suppose this was done wham bang in the middle of COVID-19 and each nation's and sector's response to COVID-19 and that major pivot that companies had to do and that individuals had to do. So it makes for interesting reading. Okay, so on to the next slide, Porrick. On to the next slide there. We're looking at that whole notion of how the workplace will transform over the next 10 years. The need to develop and upskill employees is huge. 84% emphasis put on that need to develop and upskill employees, and obviously the emphasis on the digital. Flexible working arrangements. Like never before, we pivoted to all styles of survival during lockdown. And the fallout, obviously, post-COVID, is a desire by individuals to have different working arrangements, to have the blended work arrangement, have half in, half out, whatever it is, maybe fully working from home, and what impact that is having on leadership, on the difficulties it presents, and what impact it will have on the culture of a workplace. Is the culture of the workplace so strong that it transports well, it travels well? If the culture of the workplace is not strong, what impact would these hybrid arrangements have? Then, looking at diversity in the workplace, diversity we usually think of intercultural, but bringing it the full mile in terms of balance of female, male leadership, and the need to get that right. The need to be open to that thing of DEI seems to have taken over in the language of the business world, diversity, equity, equality, and inclusion. But sometimes we forget that inclusion also spans that the male and female, okay? Leadership aspirations of employees. The leadership deck is shrinking. That bench is shrinking. So for instance, a reported 20% leadership bench in 2011, that actually has shrunk to 11% in 2021. So that augurs badly for the future. So inevitably, younger leaders are going to have to be taken on board. And that thing of mentoring and coaching workers in the workplace, spotting talent early and coaching towards leadership roles is hugely important. And we would hope that the balance of the yin and yang will be looked after in that whole conversation. Okay, the number one factor reported by DDI that influences burnout is the leadership's ability to demonstrate empathy. And believe it or not, during COVID, that dropped by 19% at a time when empathy was really, really needed. But leaders were to put to the pin of their collar. They were in unknown territory. They were grappling to pivot in order to remain effective, remain relevant. They were actually actively looking out for potential leaders among their employees to step up to the plate to assist. And they ran the real danger of burnout. I suppose in that pivot to working from home while keeping the company alive, there was a massive increase in input and throughput because people worked extended hours. That whole thing, sense of responsibility and loyalty to the company and loyalty to employees kicked in. But the leaders ran the risk of absolute burnout. So empathy was really in high demand. coaching and delegating and putting trust in employees, key employees who are showing themselves to be emergent leaders, trusting them and entrusting to, the distributed leadership model, which is so dependent on delegation. That implies trust. So when you delegate 100% with trust, and you win. You bring the employees with you. And influence. Goldman would say influence is the new currency of leadership. Your ability to consistently articulate the vision for the company and articulate it with a sense of confidence and a sense of dedication, loyalty, and throughput. So they were the top ranking areas to look out for.
It's interesting, Teresa, just before you go on, in the Complete Leader, one of the programs that we run, we've been saying for a long time, and people haven't quite understood it, that influencing people is one of the top 5 leadership skills. The ability to actually influence people and persuade people and communicate a vision to them. And also, this empathy thing is really interesting, because again, we've known since forever that EQ is the differentiator between at the top of the pile. The differentiator isn't IQ, it's EQ. And of course, the ability to empathize with people is the differentiator for senior leadership.
And it really starts with self-awareness. Goldman would argue that without self-awareness, you're missing a foundation stone for the building of all of the other areas of emotional intelligence. I would say self-awareness, knowing yourself, knowing your strengths, identifying your challenges and working on them to render them strengths ultimately, but being comfortable in your own skin, having confidence, and being able to put yourself out there and take a risk. But it also is closely aligned, to my mind, it's closely aligned to organizational awareness, understanding where you belong in the organization, who the key decision makers are, what's expected from you, and how you're perceived by your employees. That is huge. How you perceive yourself is not necessarily how others may perceive you, as we find from the disc, and how you're perceived in ordinary situations, how you're perceived in moderately stressful situations, but ultimately, how are you perceived when all hell breaks loose, such as the situation like COVID-19, totally unprecedented, unpredicted, and ill-prepared for. So the critical skills for future leaders, if you look at the urgency to develop within the next 3 years, top left quadrant, the need continued development, you're coaching and developing others, you're building partnerships. That bespeaks an openness and a confidence and a self-confidence and a strategic foresight in many ways. Delegation and delegation with confidence and empathy. The empathy, that core element of emotional intelligence. Closely aligned with empathy is compassion. And we often forget self-compassion. And we come in very badly on the stakes in terms of self-compassion. Very often we're extremely hard on ourselves and the saboteur speaks more loudly than the sage voice in our heads. Coming to the right, top right quadrant there, the urgent future gaps, that's one to watch. That notion of identifying the talent and building it with confidence, with that strategic foresight in mind. We're very much stuck in mindfulness at work. It has its place, but I think often that we get hung up on it to the detriment of strategic foresight. Now, then you're looking at managing change. Well, the only certainty of the future is uncertainty in what we're likened to call the VUCA world. Well, change is here. And we need to even think in terms of our students in our universities, getting them used to the notion and comfortable with the notion of adaptability and being open to change and open to risk-taking and open to the notion of that constant moving, like the river moving towards the sea. There's a constant movement, and that bespeaks maybe a giddy excitement towards what the future holds. Digital acumen, huge. Huge, and it is really taking hold in our education system, and the digital natives are hitting the workspace now. They're speaking a different language. The wiring of the brain is totally different to maybe the way my brain was wired in the 70s and 80s. So it's the notion of neurodiversity in the workplace is another term that's entering the vernacular. The space for those who are differently able, such as the autistic people who are really coming on stream and have islets of intelligence and they need to find their space in the workspace for the good of the whole as well. Strategic thinking, past the short-term thinking, thinking down the line, where are we going? Are we ready for the next change or the next demand that's made on us as a company and on me as a leader? And finally, the power of influencing, again, coming in huge there. That, to my mind, is the most important of all of the quadrants there in front of you. Okay. Now, I thought it would be good as a sort of a synopsis in laying the scene to look at the future megatrends. Leading through change. That bespeaks courage. It bespeaks future orientation, a future thinking. Managing burnout. So the leadership bench is reducing. Why? Because people are finding, due to the stress in the workplace and the constant bombardment and demands being made on them, that they're reaching that, if you could picture the inverted U, and you reach the peak of the inverted U, that's you're thriving there. But if you go over the top and down the other side, you're hitting towards burnout. It's the personal cost to the human of leading in today's world that we must watch. And that obviously leads us on to the notion of health and well-being in the workplace and the need for leaders not alone to look after their employees and seek out ways to ensuring health and well-being, but they must not forget themselves as well. They must find closure at the end of their workday and know how to preserve themselves and how to mind their energy levels. And, you know, they say we have the 4 pillars in our lives. We've got our home life, we've got our work life, we've got our community and friendships, and we've got our me time, our self-development. But if you trace the whole story from 2008 onwards, work seemed to be getting the lion's share of people's time. So in actually landing us to working from home, it caused a lot of people to reevaluate what is important to them in life. And I suppose it gave rise to that notion of the great resignation, where people rethought where they were going in life and what they wanted from life and what they considered important in their lives and what they had heretofore been neglecting in many ways. Then we all crave connection. I argue that it is very, very difficult to survive in working from home. I believe the blended is the best option. We need that connection. Intergenerational learning is a huge one for me. The power of that chat at the water station with a young incoming professional into your company, the nuggets of wisdom shared, how much of that are we missing if we depend entirely on working from home? What is the damage done to the growing of the culture of a workplace? Though I was working with a big pharma in the States during last summer, and some of the C-suite that I interviewed told me that they had worked from home for 15 years and were quite happy with their Friday evening town hall meetings. I was fascinated with it. Maybe it's an Irish thing. We just love to interact. I think there's huge learning there. But then again, I'm of the opinion that I don't believe in this notion of retirement. I think retirement kills. I believe in reinvention. I believe in moving with the seasons of our lives, but I believe in the sharing of the wisdom accumulated with our younger generation. And that way we're thriving them, we're setting them up, and we're setting a solid basis for the unknown world they're entering. Advancing digital work, it's here. whether we like it or not. The digital natives are being let loose on the workplace, and we've got to capitalize on that. But the one thing AI is missing is empathy, the ability to empathize. And that's where the human, I believe, must remain in the driving seat. The human being the master, AI being the tool. Okay, and that is the big challenge for the future, I believe. And finally, retaining top talent. It's one thing identifying real, true top talent, but how do we actually retain it? So, turning to having a conversation with you now, what modern day workers value most? What do you reckon in terms of valuing most in the workplace for the modern day worker, Porrick? What do you think? What do we value most in the workplace? What do modern day workers value the most in your observation from your work with the C-suite and with companies?
So I've everybody muted, Teresa, just so you know.
Yeah, maybe if you unmute them and we get a conversation going.
Okay, if you really want to.
Just for one moment. Yeah?
Okay.
Right, would anybody like to offer any observation on what modern day workers value most in the workplace?
Would recognition be something, Teresa?
Absolutely. Vital. That notion of gratitude. You've got the Hawthorne effect, which dates back into the 1930s, where the workers at an electrical organization where the productivity was lowering. And what they did was they took an ideal group out into a different space, paid them attention, praised them for the level of their work, etc., and productivity went through the roof. Then they relocated that group back in on the factory floor. And not alone did productivity, was it sustained, but they positively infected others around them as well. That feel-good factor of having been recognized, having had gratitude shown towards them, it outsmarts everything else, right down to even remuneration. Remuneration would come in number 9 on a list of 10 in terms of what's valued in the workplace.
Teresa, how about participation?
Participation, absolutely. That notion of having the psychological, a secure workplace where you are valued for your participation, but you're valued for your ideas, and that you know that you can actually offer ideas for way forward without maybe being frowned upon. Participation, huge. Anything else? Maybe striking
flexibility.
Flexibility. That flexibility, I suppose, the different styles of leadership, the democratic style of leadership, that notion of seeing the employee as a human, seeing the human and the professional, and being flexible and open to moving with the demands within the workplace and what suits the worker within the workplace, and looking after your workforce.
Okay.
I constantly come across complaints from employees where they feel that they're not being allowed to use their talent, and they feel totally straitjacketed, that they are not, that they have certain talents in certain areas and they're never allowed to shine. That, I think, is a big loss. Every company should do a talent audit and really capitalize on that talent.
I'm thinking of my kids here, when I think about the whole idea of the environment, ethics, taking care of the planet. I mean, yes. Is that an important issue, do you think, for modern day workers?
It's becoming more and more important. And in that initial exchange at interview, I think more and more of the incoming staff are trying to evaluate the company and where it stands on ESG, etc.
Yeah.
It's becoming a huge factor. And all of it obviously goes into that melting pot that becomes the culture of the workplace, which should be, I suppose, dynamic, growing, moving with the times, strategic, looking towards the future at all times. So what is balanced?
Teresa, just unmute yourself there, will you?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, continue.
So apologies for that. Balanced leadership, therefore, how do we define it? It goes beyond gender. It's about balancing our traits and our qualities. It's about finding that middle ground of oneness within self and actually translating it to our actions. It's about recognizing, valuing, developing your inner feminine and your yang, the masculine qualities. It's to find that middle ground balance where one is not actually strangleholding the other. That is the essence of finding the balance. So a balanced company, therefore, why businesses must balance both traits? Because society has a tendency to overvalue the masculine traits, the forceful, the aggressive, the argumentative, even with females making it to the top table. They mistakenly believe that they must emulate the masculine traits in order to be heard and in order to meet like with their male counterparts. And in actual fact, I believe that there's a loss in that because there's a certain strength in resting on the feminine. And really in the workplace, I believe the yin and yang, the male and female, are meant to work and balance each other. So the balanced company, it needs to attract and grow the best talent, obviously. It needs to invest in innovation, be forward thinking, invest in innovation, remain relevant in the networked economy. We are networked. Who would have thought that I could sit in my office in the Midlands of Ireland and link in with somebody in Saudi Arabia and in the afternoon have a chat with somebody in Shanghai? It is just incredible. And if you had said it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people would have said you're crazy. That's not possible. But the rate of change and the rate of advancement is such that it's very easy to fall behind these days. So you must remain relevant. And those companies that were up there with tech found that they pivoted with ease during COVID. Other companies found that they were on the back track, on the back leg, and they really were under pressure. Embrace diversity of thought in an inclusive company culture. Diversity, be open, to have that psychological security in the workplace where everybody can chime in with their view for where a company might go and might remain relevant and competitive for the future. Be led by balanced individuals. And by balanced individuals, it's those that are highly self-aware, are happy at home in their own skin. There's a consistency and a predictability about the leadership. There is nothing as bad as unpredictable leadership. Leadership that runs hot and cold, inconsistent. A coaching culture as well. That's again, I suppose, where the intergenerational learning kicks in very much. A coaching culture resting on open and honest feedback. Without the feedback and without the bigness of character to be able to accept the feedback, embrace it, and grow from that feedback, we're at a loss if we don't develop that level of maturity. Extended decision-making teams. Very often CPD for companies, it comes in the form of attending maybe online or in-person PowerPoints, and you're saturated with PowerPoints that are never revisited again. That notion of action mapping, I love. Action mapping, where we get into it, get down to it, and map a way forward together. There's a sense of collaboration engendered in that type of work. And there's a sense of we're in it together. There's a cohesiveness that results from that type of work. And to be aware of the downside of the lack of diversity. We live in a globalized world. The downside of the lack of diversity, we actually need to cultivate and nurture the yin and the yang and build on it. So what are the most common obstacles to creation of a balanced organizational culture? A deficit of real leadership. What leadership means for me may not be what my followers want. I may be overplaying what I consider my strengths to the detriment of listening to others and developing myself. It's not a static entity. It's a fluid thing that should be forever growing. A lack of a holistic vision. So ownership of vision. I believe that the workforce together should word the vision, own the vision, and the leader articulate that vision constantly, and that the vision is a fluid, moving, growing, living thing. Reactionary leadership, nothing as bad as reactionary leadership. So it's like a fire brigade service, you're always putting out fires, putting out crises. That, again, is very, very caught up in leadership style and in a leader's self-awareness and the pacing of their leadership and how it's viewed by the workforce. Inability to distinguish between what is systemic and what is symptomatic solutions. What in systemic, the underlying culture and the systems that are in place, are they serving us any longer? So the systems pre-COVID, are they serving us post-COVID? Are we open-minded enough to move and transform our leadership style to move with the times to ensure that our company remains relevant, competitive, and top of its game? Systemic culture happens when people are empowered to see and feel their way forward. So now this takes me to what cost? What cost comes from that notion of the impossible dream lived out? There is a real, I suppose, Kaplan and Kaiser, they wrote a very good book called Fear Your Strengths. And in chapter 1, they introduced this guy, Rich Spire's Talent Shimmers. And he had that really commanding presence. He had huge talent, huge appetite for leading, huge intelligence. He wielded a fireball of power and charisma. But in actual fact, the CFO said he gave up on trying to influence him. He gave up because this guy was just not listening. This guy was on his own game and he had lost his followers. So in actual fact, there's a big cost in terms of a leader's desire to be forceful and straightforward. What might that cost be? It might be a tendency to be abusive or preemptory. A devotion to consensus seeking the whole time, well, that might translate to the followers as a chronic indecision and a dilution of your leadership. An emphasis on being respectful of others, that you may run the risk of that overplayed to it being degenerating into ineffectual niceness. A desire to turn a profit and serve shareholders, that may translate into a preoccupation with short-term gains to the detriment of strategic planning. So a leader who consistently overplays his hand will ultimately be far less effective and may be accused of being an underperformer. So overusing your strengths is underperformance. A leader who embraces a strength as the only truth, consequently ignores others' version of what they feel is the truth. Okay.
I like that. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, Teresa. I like this idea of the overplayed strength and to the exclusion of everything else. And it is, of course, one of the biggest challenges we all face, because we see our strengths as strengths, and because they form an integral part of who and what we are, we think they're strengths, and the things that we don't have, we don't see them as strengths. And so it's a big challenge, I think, for us is to recognize that things that we don't necessarily value, we'll talk about these in a few minutes, don't necessarily value are in fact strengths. And things that we value may in fact not be strengths, they may in fact be weaknesses.
Yeah,
Certainly
yeah,
overplayed.
it enters the whole notion of the blind spot, which we look at in a few slides. So the yin and yang, I love that analogy. You've got the nature, we've got the interplay of dualities going on the whole time with both complementary and opposing characteristics. So you have the sky and the earth, day, night, water, fire, active, passive, male, female, all of that. Neither element takes precedence. Rather, each is valid, reinforces the other in a positive dynamic in an ideal world. And the leader who self-describes as balanced or not, task-oriented or not, people-oriented or not, runs the risk of being exclusionary. Few are able to actually combine the opposite approaches in a holistic way, rather favor one side over the other. It leads to a lopsidedness of kind, a dysfunctionality in a dysfunctional type of a play out. Now, again, coming back to Kaplan and Kaiser, they do a very good analogy here, inferior strengths, the two core dualities that confront leaders. So it's the strategic, the opposite end, the operational, or the forceful, and the enabling on the other end. So the need to be forceful combined with the need to be enabling. How do we actually work that? Strategic leadership is looking ahead and positioning the organization for the future. The operational leadership is about getting results in the short term. That dynamic tension determines what organizational issues managers focus on. So it's about achieving that balance. So when managers were rated as doing too much of either forceful or enabling, there was a 90% chance they were also rated as doing too little of the other. Yeah, and the overall pattern is that lopsided leaders are the rule and not the exception.
No surprise here, I think, Teresa.
Yeah, so you've got the virtues and the vice of forceful and enabling leadership. Okay, so look at the virtues of forceful. You're taking charge, you're declaring, you're pushing. But what's the backdrop? What's the vice? You come across as being over-controlling, you're dominating meetings, you're too demanding, and you're pushing your point of view to the detriment of maybe an equally valid or maybe even more valid point of view from the floor. Looking at the enabling, you're empowering, you're listening, you're supporting, but what are the vices? What are the drawbacks of that? You're trusting, you're not really verifying, you're receptive to a fault, so you become a soft touch. You're too nice. And that has its downsides. I remember once doing a piece of research with Trinity College on emotional intelligence as a modulator of stress among leaders. And in actual fact, as emotional intelligence went up, so also did a lack of offer of help from your employees. So also went insomnia, anxiety, a propensity to high elevated blood pressure, etc. And I remember teasing it out, and it stands to reason. If I overplay my emotional intelligence, everybody admires it in me. I maintain it by accepting all the accolades. Isn't Teresa wonderful? She's a great lady at fielding the stress and managing contentious situations. And in actual fact, I'm cutting a stick to beat myself, because rarely would one put their nose in my door and say, Teresa, you run off your feet. I'll give you an hour and help you this evening, because I'm coming across as being too able. And it really does work that you must use your emotional intelligence wisely. And you must, in doing the distributed leadership, when you delegate, you must delegate with confidence and trust, because it engenders a feel-good factor from the other side. And we're a goal-oriented people. So you give me a task to do, I say, my God, I'm going to show Porrick how good I'm at this, and I'm going to achieve, and I'm going to over the top, I'm going to achieve. All right. So the virtues and vices, looking at forceful. in the virtues of being forceful, you give offering direction, you're growth oriented, and you're an innovator. But what's the pullback? Some may accuse you of having your head in the clouds. That's impossible. You're way too ambitious and optimistic there. Your eyes are bigger than your belly, and you're fixing what isn't broken. So you're embracing change for the sake of change, to appear innovative and strategic and forward-thinking and up there with the best. Enabling, the vices of being enabling, tunnel vision, too restrictive and cost conscious. So you're actually holding yourself back, and you're rigidly process oriented. The virtues of being enabling, you're a great executor, you're highly efficient, you're entering order into the picture, but you must balance it with the downsides. Yeah?
I love your little quote down the end. See Jobs and John Scully.
Yeah, that whole thing. Really, Jobs was sidetracked there and Scully was made CEO, but in actual fact, it came full circle. And Scully did admit it was a mistake to make him CEO. That he said, looking back, it was a big mistake that I was ever hired as CEO. All of the design ideas were clearly Steve's. I'm convinced if Steve hadn't come back, when he did, Apple would never have succeeded the way they did. There would have been history that he, in actual fact, Scully, is admitting he would have plowed it into the ground.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And fair dues to him for actually for saying it, you know, and coming out about it. This is interesting because we popped up here a disc and a driving force profile. And I want to just,
looks uncannily like you, Porrick. Go on, keep going.
Well, actually, I have to acknowledge it is my profile.
Very good. So how would we work with this guy? Come on, talk to us, Porrick.
Yeah, well, I popped up mine because it's easy to talk about myself. I know myself pretty well at this stage. But okay, so if you look at this, I mean, so the question is, again, yin and yang. So again, overplaying the strength becomes a weakness. So let's just look at that as a concept here of identifying a strength. So you've got a direct D. So the person is forceful, engaged, they lean into problems and challenges, they take on risks, nothing is too big, and they're focused on results, and so on. A real strength, there's no doubt about it. Overplayed, you're a bully.
Absolutely.
Overplayed, you're domineering. Overplayed,
arrogant and insensitive.
Yeah, argumentative. You fight with everybody. And you look at my I here, so outgoing, so gregarious, outgoing, enthusiastic, great strengths. I mean, lovely things to have. Overplayed, too trusting, fear of rejection, you know, doing things, not confronting hard, not having the hard conversations with people. You look at the S there, dynamic. So moves very, very quickly, real sense of urgency, quantity, move very flexible, a real strength again in the world of business. But overplayed, can wear people out, change, constant change, slow down, where are we going? The person at the other side of the spectrum is going, oh my God, what's happening? And then if you look at the C, how we deal with procedures and constraints, well, a bit of a pioneer, bends the rules and whatever. Very, very good, very flexible, and able to make it up as one goes along. But the problem, of course, is no T's are crossed, no I's are dotted, and the wheels eventually can come off if one isn't careful. So in terms of a behavioral profile, you can see the strengths and weaknesses. And of course, and I'll talk about EQ in just a moment on this. Just pop over and look at the driving forces for a moment. What do you have? You have resourceful, intentional, commanding, and objective as the resourceful there, 96. So bottom line focus, return on investment, return on time, return on energy, and so on and so on. Really, really good bottom line focus. Overplayed? Well, overplayed, of course. All we're looking at is the result. All we're looking at is the bottom line. All we look at the return, and we forget all about the people, particularly when you see intentional scoring very, very high, 93. So you're interested in people, but you're only interested in people who can help you achieve a goal or objective. There has to be a purpose to it. You want to work with people, you want to help people, but it's always focused on typically an outcome or a result. You look at commanding there, 71, commanding, control, wants to be in control of one's own destiny, values being in control of one's own destiny, values, recognition. Again, very, very good. But of course, the problem is you're not collaborative. You're not bringing people along with you. In fact, if you look at these and you compare them to the behaviors, you see there's a lot of correlation between them. So here you've got a driven person, a focused person, results-based, return on investment, wants to do their own thing, wants to be in charge, works with people to help them achieve an outcome, and moves very, very quickly. In an entrepreneurial environment, in a startup kind of environment, that might be very, very useful. But as you move through the growth curve, if you wish, the stage of growth of an organization, that becomes really less useful. And what's required to make that effective is exactly what you said. It's the yin and yang. So you have to have the emotional intelligence to be aware of these, to see these things and realize, you talked about the impact that one has on another person, to realize this high D, for example, that direct D combined with commanding and the resourceful and the intentional combined with that, this is a very forceful person, very bottom line focused, a sort of a hard edge them, and realize that that's how people are going to perceive you. That's how they're going to experience you. You think you're being nice and chatty and friendly and funny and whatever, and they think, oh my God, will this guy ever shut up? Will he ever slow down? Will he ever listen to me? Will he ever focus on people? Will he,
And you probably would work best with somebody who would act as a bit of a handbrake on you. Somebody who would be a high S?
Well, for example, when I was in the investment world, my number two, my CFO was actually my number two. And he effectively, I was laughing at Scully and Jobs, because he effectively ran the company. So my role, of course, with this profile was to go out and create the future, find new opportunity and create the future. His role was clean up the mess behind me and make sure I didn't do too much damage. And so it worked, because he was the exact opposite. He was reflective in terms of how he dealt with problems and challenges. He was very reserved, and he was precise on his C, crossing the T's and dotting the I's, and he was steady. So he had a completely different behavioral profile. But he had similar, not dissimilar, driving forces to me. So we value the same thing. We both want the business to work. But he brought people along. He was good at smoothing everybody, bringing people along, making sure that everybody understood what we were doing, that everybody felt valued and so on. And sort of kept that bridge between me and the team, which is very, very effective.
Very, very effective, yeah. But so in the absence of somebody achieving that balance of yin and yang within, do you believe that somebody working alongside you can compensate somewhat?
Yeah, I do. I think absolutely. I think the key here, I mean, you see, we've already mentioned the blind spots, but I think the key is shared values. Yes, so if you have the shared values and you understand what we all agree what we're trying to accomplish, and then it comes down to the behavioral side. So having somebody to mediate or moderate those behaviors is useful. But I getting back to emotional intelligence that you talked about and empathy that you talked about earlier, that to me is the key. I've often asked the person, how does one adapt one's behavioral side? So you mean, how do you do it, Teresa? Well, the only way you do it is by awareness. You must be aware of the behavioral side. You must be aware of people's perception of it and the impact it's having on. So not just self-awareness, but social regulation and social awareness as well, that you can see the impact, you can regulate your behaviors based on.
It speaks to that across the lifespan, across the work span learning. And that I talked about the 4 pillars of your life. It is so important to invest in me time and self-development. And that's the only way you will try to redress an imbalance that is coming to the fore.
You know, I mean, the concept of yin and yang, I think it's a really, really nice concept and a nice way of articulating the idea of finding balance. Of course, the challenge is, how does one do this? And if I was giving, again, I don't know what your thought is on this, Teresa, but I mean, to me, the foundation of all this is EQ. That's really the foundation.
Absolutely.
I mean, you said, Goldman said, without self-awareness, there's nothing. And I believe that's true. I mean, if you ask the question, take a leader like my profile there of earlier. So take a leader with a profile like that. Would you rather a leader with a profile like that, who is self-aware, regulated, socially aware and regulated, or some beautiful profile that loves everybody's death and blah, 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 who's not aware? And so this is the challenge you're faced with. It's really about the self-awareness, isn't it?
And there's a new one coming in on stream that I spoke to you about, Porrick, and it's positive intelligence, PQ. Yeah. She said, Shameen, if you go in on positiveintelligence.ie and you can actually take the questionnaire, And you will get your report into your inbox that will identify your top 3 saboteurs. Shameen reckons that we've got the judge as the saboteur, and it has 9 accomplices. And that most of the main decisions we've made in our lives probably was under the influence of the saboteur. But the trick is, through a series of meditative type of PQ reps, run across a series of every so often during the day, across an extended period of time, you can actually strengthen the sage muscle of the brain and disempower the saboteur. It's extremely interesting. I actually just did a 7-week course on it and would consider becoming certified in the area of PQ. It's one to get in early into a person's life, because really one of the exercises was returning to that essence of a child, a picture of yourself under the age of 10, and that face full of bright expectation and love of life. And the trick, it was amazing to see a very high-powered executive return to a picture of himself as an 8-year-old. I said, my God, it was like he had been chiseled into being what wasn't true to himself for a company's gain for most of his best years. But now in his early 60s, had come back to this PQ journey of rediscovering self. And confidence in self.
It is interesting. If one looks at the model and says there's many sciences out there, there's many ways that you can actually develop and grow. Without doubt, the whole thing of developing your emotional awareness, just developing awareness in general. You mentioned mindfulness earlier, and mindfulness and meditation and exercise. There's many, many different things one can do to make oneself spend time in nature, make oneself more aware. But it has to be practiced. It has to be learned. It has to be practiced.
And there's the pace and the slowing down. I think we've lost ourselves in speed. And it's the being happy to be with oneself and to pace oneself.
Yeah.
That's what we need to return to.
Yeah. That was excellent, Teresa. And I'd really like to thank you for that fascinating talk. No doubt about it. Fascinating talk. I hope our participants enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, I think maybe the steps to achieving balanced leadership then is commitment to change. That whole notion of being committed to change and understanding the forward movement of change and the excitement it engenders.
It's interesting. I don't mean to jump in, but it is interesting that you say that. And I cannot tell you the number of times I've worked with somebody who's not committed to change. It's an intellectual exercise for them. But again, if you think about this, everything ultimately gets translated into behavior. Everything. It starts in lots of different places, but it ends up in a behavior that somebody experiences. And I'm always fascinated to talk to leaders who talk about this and say, yep, I understand, I get the message. But they don't actually want to change. They want everybody else to change. But they're not actually committed to change. This thing of commitment to change is very, very big, Teresa, and not obvious.
And it begets hope. And we need hope. Without hope, we're going nowhere. And I feel that we really need to get excited about the future and be hopeful and, cast aside the doom and gloom, but embrace change and move forward with it and see the assets that are contained in being a networked world,
Yeah, very good. Okay. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up. I'd like to thank everybody who showed up. Really appreciate it. I'd really like to thank you, Teresa. That was
not at all.
Actually, it was actually really fascinating. And I just like the idea of getting a new concept into our head, an idea of balance.
Balance, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. As always, I love working with you, Porrick. Thank you.
Thank
you, everybody, for attending. Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody. Cheers. Bye-bye.